Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Winds and Currents webinar. Today, we're fortunate to have Erik van Sebille, who is going to talk about transport of marine plastics. When is fine resolution fine enough? So I'll let you take it away, Erik.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thanks for having me at this exciting series of webinars. I'm glad that I can also do my part here and well, give my pitch essentially for why it is so important to have good estimates of surface currents and surface ocean velocities if you want to, for example, understand how plastic moves through the ocean, as happens to be my research interest. So what you see here is a map of the data of the global surface velocity program data set. So the NOAA GDP data set that many of you will probably have seen, the surface drifters that move through the ocean. And if you plot it like this, of course, it looks very impressive. It's a spaghetti plot. You see all of the individual trajectories randomly colored here. Really, well, I don't know how well it comes across through the internet, but at least here, you beautifully see all the tiny wiggles, all the scales of motion that are captured by these surface drifters. But at the same time, you also see wide gaps in the Arctic, of course, where there's sea ice, but also close to where I live, actually, in the Netherlands, in the North Sea. It's just too shallow for there to be any surface drifters going into the North Sea. And many other areas that are poorly sampled, especially in the tropics. Which of course are very important then to global climate. So even though the surface drifters are a fantastic data set, if you look at it at an animation, at what is there at any particular time, you see that this is not the kind of resolution that would be sufficient to really say about what the ocean is doing at this moment. And what the surface currents are doing right at this moment. If you really want to use this to get any kind of mapping products that you can then feed into simulations of the drift of material, for example, you would just need too much interpolation, and especially again at the tropics. But there's another problem, and that is, well, of course, that most of the drifters are drogued. And the drogues, as many of you will know, they detach at some point. The engineering of especially this part of the drogues is just too difficult. You can't make anything that keeps a sea anchor and extremely buoyant float connected for more than a few months to maybe a few years or so. And in the end, it just happens that in the total data set of all these drifters, that roughly half of the data are from drifters that still have their drogue, and half of the data are from drifters that don't have their drogue anymore. And what we learned from that is actually that the dispersion patterns of those drifters are fairly different. That whatever happens at the surface by the undrogued drifters is different from what happens with the drogued drifters. And one of the examples that really nicely shows this is a study by Mirjam van der Meen. She did her PhD at the University of Perth. She just finished it last year or so. And what she looked at the accumulation patterns. So through a transit matrix approach, I don't think that matters too much for now, but essentially looking at the infinite forward time of where would all these drifters eventually end up if they would just stay in the ocean for decades to centennial timescales. And what you see is that, especially in areas like the Indian Ocean here, the drogued drifters end up in a really different place than the undrogued drifters. So sure, both the drogued and the undrogued drifters end up in what we now know are the garbage patches in the Pacific Ocean, in the Atlantic Ocean, but there is a bit of a difference between what happens at the surface and what happens at 15 meters. And this, I think, is an important case for why we need an instrument or an observational system that can really measure stuff at the surface. We don't have that yet. That's what this seminar series in some ways is about, I guess. So for my science, I stick with models. I stick with simulations. And the good thing is about simulations are that they can create beautiful animations. The bad thing about it, of course, that you never know how real they are. But let's park that for the moment in this seminar. Let's just go and look at what happens in these models and what can we learn about the skills and the processes that actually determine the dispersion of material at the surface of the ocean. And this is then, I guess, an archetypical standard to start with. This is a simulation done by David Wichmann, who was a PhD student in my group, and he just very simply took a global 112 degree surface flow field and started that with a uniform concentration of particles. And if you integrate those virtual particles forward in time, what you see is that very rapidly the equator clears out and areas of accumulation appear here in the subtropical gyres. The famous garbage patches in the North Pacific, in the North Atlantic, in the South Pacific, South Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean, of course. And you also see that the Southern Ocean also clears out. And if you would ask an oceanographer why this is, then you would get the answer, oh, well, that's easy, that's Ekman. Right? Ekman convergence here creates accumulation in the gyres. And yes, that's true, but it's actually not in the way that you would think it is. Already 4 years ago, I had a master's student in my group, Victor Oning, who came up with a really fun idea to ask, well, what happens if you do the same simulation, so put virtual particles, but advect them only with the Ekman currents? This would, of course, be a very hypothetical question. I mean, you would never have an ocean where you only have the Ekman currents, but the ESA block current product actually splits up the surface flow into an Ekman component and a geostrophic component. So we could do this here, a simulation purely and only with Ekman. And the first time I saw that, I was really amazed at what happens. I had not expected this. It looks something like this. So what you see is that, yes, the tropics and the Southern Ocean are very quickly cleared by, indeed, Ekman transport. But in fact, even the gyres are almost entirely cleared by Ekman transport. And what happens is that the Ekman transport creates extremely thin, almost lines of convergence in the Pacific Ocean, in the Atlantic Ocean, and also in the Southern Hemisphere. We didn't have more data than this at the moment, so at that time, so we couldn't really run it even forward longer in time. But my expectation would be that really what the Ekman doing is really making zonal bands of extremely high concentrations on a time varying field visits, right? That's interesting. Now, why is this then not what we see in the total surface field? Well, that's of course because there's also geostrophy. So you can also run a simulation with the particles only in the geostrophic currents. And that looks like this. And what you see here would hopefully not come as a surprise, is namely nothing happens. The geostrophic field by definition is divergence free. So if you put virtual particles in there, then they move around a bit, but you don't get accumulation. Now, if you look carefully, you do get some divergence along the equator, but that's of course because, well, what does geostrophy even mean at the equator? And you also see some effects of the sea ice in the Southern Ocean, where sometimes the particles seem to freeze in and then flow again. But I really want to focus here on the subtropical gyres, where yeah, things move around, but you don't get accumulation or divergence. So it really is divergence free. And then apparently it's a combination of these two fields, the geostrophy and the Ekman, that then create the garbage patches as we've seen them, as they come out from the drifters, as we see them in ocean models. And that was the presentation that I gave until, say, 3-4 years ago or so. And as a physical oceanographer trained on large-scale ocean circulation, I was super excited by this. I was excited to see that, we could use theories, geostrophic theory, Ekman theory, essentially Sverdrup theory, if you want, to really understand the basin scale dynamics of the accumulation of plastic. But I've since come to realize that actually the more interesting questions are not at the basin scales. The interesting questions are far below the gyre scales. And this is a map that comes from a data set painstakingly collected by Cara Lavender-Law and her colleagues at the Sea Education Association in Woods Hole. And what they did is, over decades of time, took samples of the amount of small plastic that they found in nets, in plankton trawl nets, manta nets that they trawled through the ocean, and then tried to estimate or counted how much pieces of plastic there are per square kilometer, right? Because the net has a certain width and you trawl through the ocean, so how many pieces of plastic you count in the net can be converted to a number per square kilometer. And that's the map over here, where of course you see Florida over here and Cuba. And the key thing is that there's 2 orders of magnitude difference. And that variability is actually more on the small scale than on the large scale. It's hard to find a consistent kind of garbage patch here. It's hard to find this accumulation zone just because the data is so extremely noisy. Sometimes data points can vary easily by 2 orders of magnitudes within mere kilometers. And you don't see the time dimension here, because of course, not all of these observations have been taken at the same time points, but even sometimes you get two trawls that are taken in the same day, just close to each other, with orders of magnitude difference amount of plastic. And the question then is, of course, why is that? What sets this extremely strong spatial heterogeneity, temporal spatial heterogeneity of the plastic, even in the large scale gyre basins? Now, people have started to look into that. I was a bit involved with a study by a French group who took, I guess, the simplest thing what you can do. They took a sailboat. They started somewhere in the Caribbean. They sailed it north into, well, what is the garbage patch here, this yellow area, and they took a bunch of samples, again with a manta net, and again they trawled it, and again they found how much plastic is there. And the key thing that they did for this data set is then they compared it to sea level anomalies, right? And they were, well, actually, the design of the study was that they would sample one cyclonic eddy and one anticyclonic eddy. So while they were actually in the area, they got steered by a ground crew that helped them to locate where the anticyclone was and where the cyclone was. And indeed, if you then measure the amount of plastic found in the net as a function of whether it was in this area of sea level anomaly taken, or in the medium area or in the high area, you see that there's a significant difference. More plastic in the area where there was a higher sea level anomaly. Now this got published, but since then, I don't think anyone else has been able to reproduce this data set. So this is really an N-is-1 study, right? We had one cyclone, one anticyclone, and yes, we found more plastic in the anticyclone than in the cyclone. But I for sure have tried with my students many times already to find a consistent relationship between cyclonic eddies and anticyclonic eddies compared to, say, the data set that I showed before. And it's really, really hard to find any significant relationship. And in fact, we were not able to do that. So it can't only be the eddies. It's not the mesoscale that determines whether there's more plastic in one place than in another place. It must be even smaller scales. And that's, I think, where things become really exciting and really interesting. I don't have the answer yet, but I do have an idea of what all the processes are that need to be taken into account if you want to understand the transport of floating marine debris. And this comes out of a paper that we wrote for a SCORE working group. This was one of the deliverables. We had a large meeting here with lots of experts. I think some of the people who wrote this paper are now also in the audience. And during the meeting, we came up with, well, what are the typical processes that are important, likely, for the transport of marine plastic? And unfortunately, for most of those processes, we couldn't say anything more than that we think it is important, but we didn't know how it was important. And especially, we didn't know how those processes would actually interact with the other processes. So this is a huge open area still of uncertainty, of unknowledge, knowledge about the ocean that we still lack. And that is, I think, the critical point that I want to make during this seminar, is that the plastic that's polluting our ocean is an atrocity, right? And society should be ashamed. I mean, it is really an atrocity that there's plastic now under the ice, in the deepest part of the ocean, etc., etc. But at the same time, this floating plastic provides a unique opportunity to improve our fundamental understanding of ocean processes. So there's a bit of a silver lining, if you're an oceanographer, to this plastic. It's a tracer or a proxy like no other. It behaves differently than most of the traces that we use in oceanography. Think about the CFCs, think about nutrients, think about temperature and salinity, of course. It has different sources. So, and it is relatively easy to measure, and it has been measured a lot already over the past. So we have a good data set of where plastic is when and where. Now we need to understand why is the plastic there. And that then links up with a big process and project led by Nikolai Maximenko on the Integrated Marine Debris Observing System, IMDOS. And this is a goal. It was a white paper for OceanOps 2019 to really come up with a global effort on measuring marine debris, and in particular marine plastic, and trying to understand why it is where we find that it is. Or maybe even more exciting, to try and play the blame game, to try and find whose plastic ends up where. Because that's the challenge, right? Trying to know where plastic is. If you find a piece of plastic somewhere, how can you identify where it came from? And how can you use ocean currents and maybe backtracking of ocean currents to say anything about the provenance of plastic? We can't do that yet. There are plenty of attempts. My group is also trying to do this with Bayesian statistics, but also with inferences based on the chemistry of plastic, the biofouling, all kinds of approaches. But we're not nearly there yet. It's really, really difficult to play this blame game. We can do it for other floating material, though. And one of the interesting or the most exciting interdisciplinary works that I've been involved with in the past few years is actually the quest for finding the source of all other type of floating material. And that is kelp, large seaweed, bull kelp, that was found on the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, on King George Island here. It was found by a Chilean biologist that walked along this beach, saw this piece of kelp lying there and realized that that doesn't belong on King George Island. It is not an organism that lives anywhere close to Antarctica. In fact, the only places where it's known to grow are all the white triangles over here. And all of them are north of the subpolar front. So this is a subpolar species that somehow ended up on the Antarctic Peninsula. Now, you could say, okay, well, that can happen. But of course it can't if you think about Ekman transport. The Ekman drift in the Southern Ocean is very much northward. So anything that floats, how could it ever go southward? The cool thing about kelp, or any biological organism is that, of course, you're able to track the genetics of it, the DNA. And don't ask me what exactly is in this graph because I'm not a geneticist, but essentially the point is that the piece of kelp that was found over here is most similar to what was found that grows either in the Kerguelen or in South Georgia. So either here or here is where it belongs. So the question is then, okay, how is it even possible for kelp to go from the Kerguelen or from South Georgia against the prevailing northward Ekman transport towards King George Island? And Adele Morrison at ANU then did some simulations. She did a simulation in the HICOM model where she started virtual particles right here on this island, and none of the particles, all the red lines here, came even close to Antarctica. None of them actually crossed really the polar front. It was only when she added Stokes drift that actually, up to 1% or so of all the particles did end up, so those are the blue lines over here, did end up on the Antarctic continent. So really, when you have the ocean model and Stokes drift, then you have enough southward transport for those particles to end up close to the continent. Interestingly, by the way, was that if she ran the same model with monthly average flow fields, so essentially suppressing the eddy kinetic energy, but with the Stokes drift, then again, none of the particles came even close to Antarctica. So it's really the combination of an eddying ocean, 1/12 degree in this case, and additional Stokes drift from the winds, from the waves, that pushed sufficiently particles southward so that they could exit. And that could maybe explain why you can find a piece of kelp that normally grows over here on the beach on the Antarctic Peninsula. And indeed, when Victor again did the simulation, he already tried only advecting particles in the Ekman flow, only advecting particles in the geostrophic flow. When he tried it only in the Stokes drift flow from wave 3 in this case, then he saw that many of the particles, especially in the Southern Ocean, do get pushed slightly southward. So there is this slight southward transport. Most of it is eastward, but it's also a bit southward towards Antarctica. And if you think, if you look at this animation for the rest of the ocean, you again see the same lines appearing, just like in the Ekman transport, but at completely different places, much closer to the equator. And there's also almost this kind of pitchfork structure in the Western Pacific. I don't think anyone has looked at this yet and what this actually means, but it's really interesting. So this was for kelp, and to use kelp as kind of a proxy for plastic because of the DNA analysis, and also just because there's less kelp in the ocean, there's going to say more definitive things about how ocean currents actually transport material around. Another good example is pumice. So this is the material that sometimes forms after an underwater volcano. It's essentially it's volcanic rock, but it's extremely buoyant. It has so much air in it that it literally floats on the surface of the ocean, creates this kind of like really weird surface of rock, as if the entire ocean is as if you could walk on it. Of course, you can't in this case, but it's quite bizarre. And there was a big underwater volcano eruption near the island of Tonga back in, what would it have been, 2018 or so, 2017. Anyway, because the pumice is so large, you can actually spot it from satellites, from just visual in a visual channel. You can see this in remote sensing, and you can then track how the entire pumice field actually moves over time through the tropical Pacific Ocean, in this case, the southern tropical Pacific Ocean. And what we did in a simulation was that we could then compare how our model, our simulation, compares to the observations. So what you see here in the dots with the black circles are the observations of the center of mass, approximately, of the pumice field over time, and the color is the time. And the open circles are a simulation with the forecasting field of the Copernicus marine surface. So again, a 112-degree NEMO model, but actually in forecasting mode, because we're really interested in how good is this model actually in forecasting. And then you have to make a choice, whether you add windage, whether you add Stokes drift or not. The bottom line being, well, the forecast doesn't really do very well. So even the Copernicus marine surface, which is what we in Europe here all use for forecasting for our projections up to a day in advance of what the ocean currents are doing, was not really able to track the pumice draft, and especially it went way too fast. The currents were much faster than actually was happening in reality, what the centers of mass were doing. So, plenty to do, plenty still to understand about the interaction of Stokes drift, geostrophic currents, Ekman currents, eddies, but also much smaller scale feature, Langmuir circulation, submeso-scales, internal tides, how all of those in the open ocean actually shape the accumulation and the dispersion and the transport of plastic, I think is a really, really exciting scientific question that also has an important societal impact, of course. But I'm not really doing that anymore. And the reason is that I also realized that all this open ocean questions, all these questions about how the open ocean works, how garbage patches form, is maybe sidetracking us a little bit from where the really big questions are, because they seem to be much closer to shore. This is a figure from a paper that was published in Nature Sustainability 2 years ago. I was also a little bit involved, but it really came out of a group from Spain, led by Carmen Morales Casellas. And what she did was she collected data and data sets of beach cleanups, or well, cleanups in general. So people who had gone out, collected waste, and then counted how many pieces of waste they'd found in the environment. And she did this all over the world, many, many data sets. And she then separated those, first of all, into, well, where was the data actually collected? Whether it was nearshore waters, rivers, shorelines, riverbeds, seafloor, deep seafloor, open waters. She looked at the material types. I won't really go too much into that, but most of it was plastic. There's the dark blue here. She looked at the plastic type, whether it was rigid or film or line. That's also not too important for now. But what is important, and she looked at the origin, and that's important. So was it takeout consumer? Was it ocean and waterway? Was it industrial and household, medical hygiene, or was it smoking, essentially cigarette butts? And what you can see already here is that for most of those compartments, most of the items found were takeout consumer, except for open water. There it was actually mostly from ocean and waterway, which is essentially fisheries. Now, this she then turned into a material flow analysis, or put through a material flow analysis model to come up with this figure. It's the same data, but now visualized in a different way, estimating actually the fluxes between the different reservoirs. And the first time I saw this, I thought like, okay, so there goes all my efforts on trying to understand how garbage patches form. Because in fact, there's very little exchange between whatever comes into the ocean from rivers or shorelines or near shore and what ends up in the open waters. The surface oceans, the global surface oceans, hardly any of the plastic found there comes from near shore. I don't understand why. I don't have a good reason for why it is, but from this data set at least, it seems very clear that there's a distinction between plastic that starts on coastlines and stays near shore, and the plastic that starts in the ocean and stays in the ocean. It could be that this is because the study focused on what are called macroplastics, large pieces of plastics, right? The plastics that you can still identify, that you know whether they came from a bottle or from a food container or from a bag. So it could be that this strong separation between the nearshore waters and the open waters is only there for larger pieces of plastic. On the other hand, when we did a simulation, when Victor Oning, when he was a PhD student in Bern, in the group of Charlotte Laufkotter, he did a simulation where he started virtual particles that are, as we hope, representative of microplastic, starting them from every location around the coastlines around the world. And what he then particularly looked at in this simulation, so he started them close to the coastline and looked at how far away from the coastline did they get. So what was the furthest distance that they reached within a timescale of 5 years from the coastline before, during that 5 years. And that's the scale over here. It's a bit complicated. So blue is very far, and that of course is the case for all the islands in the Pacific, because it's very easy there to go very far away. But yellow is very close by. And what you see is actually that a lot of coastlines, much of the plastic doesn't get much further than say 10 kilometers to maybe 100 kilometers or so in 5 years' time. This plastic just stays near shore for a very long time. Depends a bit on how you define the beaching probability, how much likelihood you put to a particle that's close to coastline actually beaching again. That's here, so you have to set a timescale to that. But in any case, half or so of all the plastic, it doesn't get further than 500 kilometers from the coastline. That's the way that you have to read this figure over here, right? So most plastic really is very local, is very near to shore. And that's interesting, because now there's kind of like a whole line of evidence about, well, how then to deal with the plastic. You know, in the more than 10 years now that I've been working on plastic transport in the ocean, you don't want to know how often I've been asked, so what should we do about the plastic? And I always said, well, I'm an oceanographer, I don't know. I just want to understand how the currents work. But lately I've started to really come to a more clear kind of like direction of answers that could be set. And I think it's this line of thought. So first of all, most of the mass of plastic is in large items, macro size items, more than 5 centimeters. And this has been known already for a very long time. I mean, most particles themselves are small, but if you purely look at the mass of plastic, then more than 90%, maybe more than 95% or so is in the large items, which makes sense, right? Because they're large, so they contribute a lot to the total mass of plastic. The other thing that we've known from Carmen's work, but probably also before already, is that most of the marine plastic actually originates from land. Most plastic that ends the ocean doesn't come from the ocean itself. It's not fisheries related. On a global scale, it comes from land. And then we find, and that's Victor's work, but also other work, also by the people from the Ocean Cleanup, for example, that most of them, at least the macroplastic, stays in the coastal zone for a while. It stays there, it doesn't really get very far away. It kind of like constantly bounces back between the coast and the ocean, coast effect. And we also know that most fragmentation into microplastic occurs on coastlines. So that is actually where an entire bottle fragments into maybe 1 million microplastic or so. That doesn't happen so much in the open ocean. The timescale fragmentation is much faster on coastlines. And finally, we know that cleanup on coastlines is very efficient. So if you want to take out pollution, plastic pollution anywhere, then just do it on the coastlines. On the coastlines, really, if you remove plastic there, then you prevent fragmentation, you prevent plastic from going back into the ocean. So it's a very, very effective way of removing a lot of mass from the ocean very quickly. And as a bonus, there's fantastic work by Kaylee Wiles, who's an environmental psychologist in the UK, who actually showed that beach cleanups are good for your mental health. She did an experiment where she had people walk along a beach and then assess their mental health benefit from that beach with some psychological questions and those kind of things. And she showed that people that just walk on a beach and try to ignore the pollution and the plastic that's there have less benefit from that beach walk than the people that also pick up the plastic when they're walking there. So next time that you go to a beach, pick up the plastic that you see. It's not only good for the ocean, it's also good for your mental health. But back to what the seminar series is then all about, that is kind of my call to action, is that really if you want to understand transport mechanisms, especially of plastic in the ocean, you need to understand coastal transport processes. How plastics go from the shoaling zone into the shoreline, what the effect of the surf zone is, how the underflow actually impacts this, what the wave breaking is doing to plastic transport. It could very well be that, for example, smaller microplastics in breaking waves get injected deeper into the ocean, into the water, so that they are more easily caught in the underflow and actually get further out, so that an ocean that is more has more surf energy, is more breaking waves, actually less microplastic ends up on the coastline. It's an interesting, somewhat counterintuitive effect, I would say. So this is now my research agenda. My research agenda is to try and understand, to try and create a simulation, a model, to really encapsulate all of these important processes on how macroplastics move by ocean flows. And the way that I'm approaching that is that I take as a starting point the ocean general circulation models, the ones in green here, right? And this is the space-time diagram that you've all seen before, I assume. But here I've drawn it in such a way that this is now all the processes that are important for the transport of plastic that are captured or are resolved by ocean general circulation processes, or these velocities associated with those are resolved. The gyres, geostrophic currents, the residuals of the tidal currents nowadays are actually resolved. Boundary slope currents, submesoskale eddies are up to, say, well, the best ocean general circulation models can now do that up to a few hundred meters or so. And then there are all these other processes that we know are important, from Stokes drift, as I said, Langmuir circulation probably, the actual barotropic tidal currents, the alternating currents. So here the barotropic currents, the baroclinic currents probably, also windage, maybe even inertia is important, all the coastal phenomena. And one way to approach this would just be to try and get this dotted line further to the left and further down, right? That's a traditional way that ocean modelers think about this problem. It's just trying increase the amount of capture scales in the ocean model. But what you can also do is put those processes on the virtual particles, so that effectively the forces associated with, say, Langmuir circulation or with Stokes drift are not computed by the ocean model itself. They are directly computed on the particle, and they move the particle in a certain direction. Now, this is my pipe dream, if you want, my future, what I want to build in my team. I can do this in ocean general circulation models, but of course I would be even happier if I could do this in remote sensed surface velocity products. And that is where I hope that in the coming years we can really see progress. We can see something going up into space to help us carve out a space over here where really all of these surface flow processes are captured, And then I will do the rest with my virtual particles. But at least then we have a good start. That's what I wanted to say and what I wanted to end with. I do have one extra slide. It's a bit of an advertisement. Maybe some of you have seen it already, but we are actually we're recruiting an assistant or associate professor in remote sensing at our institute. So where I work, there's an open position. It's a tenured position. We've even done away with tenure tracks. So if you would get this position, you are immediately tenured. I think an 18 months trial period or so. But if you're interested, either directly apply or send me maybe a message if you have more questions. But we're looking for someone who can do remote sensing. It doesn't matter if it's ocean or atmosphere or ice. Of course, I would be very happy if it would be ocean. And then, so that's then the conclusions, right? To recap it all, the plastic littering our ocean is an atrocity and society should be ashamed, as I said. But the plastic is also really an opportunity to better understand how the ocean works. Now, small-scale processes have a crucial role in the transport of plastic. And the challenge is to capture these processes in our numerical simulations of the transport of material. And finally, removing plastic from the ocean is likely most effective on coastlines. And remote sensing should thus also focus on nearshore zones. And then before I wrap up and maybe finish everything up, I do want to highlight that, of course, most of what I've presented is done by my team. It's done by the fantastic people. I could only do this because of their support, because of all the hard work that I put in. And I really want to thank them all the people that have worked with me over the past 6 years here in Utrecht, from postdocs to bachelor students to master students. It's their work really that I have the privilege to explain to you here, but I couldn't do it without them. Thank you.
Thanks, Erik. This was a really wonderful talk. Questions for Erik? There have been some useful comments in the chat from Megan Cronin and Jamie Pringle. I think I want to start, though, by asking, one of the things that's on people's minds is that the SWAT satellite has just launched, and it will, as soon as it starts producing data, it will provide sea surface height, so geostrophic velocity, but not the rest. And that's led to a question, how important is the rest? So you've talked about that, but yeah, I'll ask anyway. This is eating at people.
Yeah, I think we don't know yet. We don't know to what extent the rest, say Langer circulation, for example, is what I often think about, Stokes drift, how important that is to large-scale dispersion patterns. But I've shown you some examples where we think it is an important driver, that it matters for large-scale transport processes to include Stokes drift and probably also Langer circulation. The other thing that I haven't talked about at all, but that I think would be even more important to consider is the interaction with marine life. Right? Why do people, right, the rest of the world, the non-oceanographers, why do they care about plastic in the ocean? They care about it because it interacts with marine life, because it impacts marine life. Now, marine life, the heterogeneity of marine life correlates with some of the structures, including the small-scale structures that we that are not resolved by SWOT. So at the moment that there's a correlation on one hand between plastic concentration and oceanographic features, and also marine life and oceanographic features, then it becomes interesting to ask, well, do ocean currents put plastic in the same place where you have maximum marine life, or do they actually separate them out? That's what that's why, for example, the study of the eddies that I showed, right, the cyclonic and anticyclonic eddy. If you have the simple view that an anticyclonic eddy is oligotrophic and hardly anything lives there, and the cyclonic eddy is very productive because it's upwelling of water. Of course, that's a bit of an old-fashioned view, but if that's your kind of like thinking framework, then you would say, fantastic that there's more plastic in the anticyclonic eddy than in the cyclonic eddy. Because it means that there's a separation of plastic and marine life. The question is if that's for Langmuir circulation, how that would work, for example, on the global scale. The question if how that works in coastal zones. Those are, I think, the important questions.
Thanks. Yeah, lots to think about, lots to explore. Megan Cronin has her hand up.
Yeah, hi, Erik.
Hey.
Nice talk. And so I noticed in that reference the global study of the coastlines and the separation, that it was always the western boundary currents that you had the large distances.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, so, okay, that means that the western boundary currents provide a pathway to the interior, and that makes a lot of sense, except that when you start thinking about it, exactly how does that happen? I mean, is it associated with, you know, a meander process, and like maybe if you're in one phase of the meander where you have cross flow jet, maybe, you know, and which phase would you see that? I mean, does it actually show up?
Yeah.
And, or is it related to, you know, some kind of other process? Anyway, I'm really curious about that. And it seems like there's a lot of implications for biology and other things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good observation. It's one that we also made, of course. It's really clear to see in the Gulf Stream or in the eastern US. It's also very clear on the Geo.
Well, actually, all of them. Every single one of them.
Yeah, even the Agulas. I mean, just a bit here, but yeah. And it's strange to some extent if you think about the western boundary current as a frontal zone, right? So I think it has to do something with the separation. But to be honest, yeah, we haven't further looked into this. The data set, I think that the data set of all the trajectories is there. So if anyone wants to have a go at it and just look at it, then be our guest. Victor's not doing it. He works at a bank. So.
Interesting.
Yeah. But a good observation. Yeah.
So there's come in the chat saying not the Brazil current. Momihel has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Very nice talk. You mentioned the last part of the talk, like what you want to do, and there's right when you have your scale time plot. There's of course always things that are not resolved in the model, and I think you mentioned you want to model this in some way along the particle. So how do you have to do some stochastic stuff there? Maybe you can, give a hint how you want to do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so this literally comes from a proposal that I've just submitted. So I'm not even yet funded to do this, but I thought I'd throw it out there so that if I don't get the funding, at least someone else will try. But so a good example, I mean, we did it already for the for the alternating barotropic tidal currents. And what we did was essentially, there are like the FES product, right? This French tidal flow product. What you can do is you can literally, at the particle, you know exactly where the particle is, you know the time that the particle is at. You can just calculate the local barotropic velocity from that product. It's not within the OGCM, but you can then say that the tides will move the particle in a certain way. And the good thing is that because they're all sines and cosines, they're all trigonometric functions, you can literally on the effective time stepping of the particle, which is minutes, you can calculate this every single time. You know what the local velocity at that time and at that location is, and you can add that to the total currents. The same you could do with the Stokes drift, for example, or for maybe even for the Langmuir circulation. So within a grid cell, if you know that there's going to be Langmuir circulation, you can create spatial heterogeneity below the grid scale just by having the particles essentially adding a local Langmuir cell there, or a set of Langmuir cells. It's a bit like the approach that the cloud physics people are taking with their superparameterization, but then for virtual particles. So anything that can't be resolved by the global ocean circulation model, you just put it in tiny models inside the grid cell. Yeah, but if this gets funded, ask me in 5 years, and I'll have it all.
Probably asked you earlier, but yeah, that's very interesting.
Thanks. Elizabeth Remy. Oops, muted, I think.
We don't hear you,
Or
Elizabeth.
not.
And one more time. No, still
No.
don't hear.
Why don't we go on to Luc Lena and
Yeah.
oh, maybe I
Now
think
we
you got
hear
it
you.
now.
Yeah.
There we go.
Now we hear.
Okay, great. Sorry. So it's really linked to the previous questions. Since now there's quite high resolution model with high frequency outputs, you can have some signals below a day. Did you try to simulate particle trajectories with really high frequency outputs, and where, for example, the inertial oscillation can play a role? And does it make a real difference, or what do you expect?
Yeah, so we tried that in a ESA project, the World Ocean Circulation Project, and Clement Ubelman, who you may know, is also in this kind of world. He tried really putting those inertial oscillations also on the particle level. I think a publication is coming out, but I haven't seen that for a while. But yeah, you can try that. The other thing that we're trying right now is baroclinic tidal currents. So with and without internal tides, and seeing actually how the surface accumulation of particles changes if you add internal tides. Yeah.
Okay, it may have an impact more on the coastal oceans than the open ocean, or maybe
Probably.
not only.
Yeah, yeah, that's what we're thinking too. I mean, so the barotropic tides that we did a while ago, and that has no impact in the open ocean. It doesn't matter whether you have barotropic tides or not, because they're essentially too linear, right? The particles will go back and forth. So there's not enough linearity in there to really make an impact. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Next is Luc Lena.
Yeah, actually on this plot here that you have, I can't help noticing that you didn't bring up the wave breaking induced mass transport. Are you planning to include this in those simulation if you get funded? I'm a little biased.
If you tell me how, sure. I mean, yeah. Good point. I hadn't thought about that.
I mean, there is
maybe it shouldn't be here if it's important, and or even if it's not important. I mean, the goal to do this is to also get a bit of an estimate of which processes really are the leading order processes and which are not. So even the less important processes, I'd be happy to put them in this model.
Yeah. It's important because, you know, if you think about, you know, surface drift, you know, especially with works that we've done here, but also that Ton van Bremer has been pushing forward, we're starting to converge and you know, to the fact that it does matter. Yeah, I think it'd be great to have another box.
I'll put it in.
Great. Fabrice.
Well, first of all, I just want to say hello. I'm here with the C-Star Mag in Aztec. So we're all watching together the seminar. So thank you all for having us. And just also want to say hello to Erik for his contribution to SCIM for EE9. So if I may want to try a question is, so we have these two different concepts, either going for ATI, pretty high resolution, 1 kilometer resolution, and coastal sampling, maybe coming up, every couple of days or some, shifting one day after the next day, but very high resolution. And then Odyssey is going for global, maybe twice a day, but very much coarser resolution, 30 kilometers. And we're all trying to make the case that we need to define requirements, as you know, for these missions. And there's potentially a trade-off between resolution and accuracy. And so maybe I'm going to put it to you. So it seems that when you look at drift, it seems that because you're integrating over a long time, potentially the instantaneous errors are not so important, but maybe they average out over a long time, or is that a very crude approximation? You think we have to be very careful? So can you comment on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't. So that last part, I wouldn't say that errors average out, because I think it is exactly the interaction between all of these processes that leads to certain transport, right? That's why Lagrangian oceanography is so much more fun to do than aeronautic, because all of these arrows, they keep adding up. And if there are interactions, if say particles get into an area with more shear so that they have a higher current, experience a higher current, then they get into another regime. So I would say that accuracy is probably more important than resolution. Also because I guess the case that I'm making here is that maybe we shouldn't worry too much about resolution. Maybe if this is all done by an observing system, either whether it's a model or a satellite constellation or whatever, or one satellite, then this, if we understand the physics, if we really have a good model for what the physics is doing, maybe we can put this on the virtual particles themselves and really get these hybrid approaches. So shooting from the hips, I would say no go for it.
High resolution observation to learn that bit that then you can parameterize in your other. Yeah. So maybe we need both C-Star and Odyssey then in the end, right?
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
Thanks.
One final question before we wrap up. Jamie Pringle put in the chat, he's in a coffee shop and doesn't want to ask out loud, but he wants to know how confident you are in predicting how turbulence moves small floating particles off the surface and into even a few centimeters below the surface in the context of Stokes drift, for example.
Yeah, that I think is a key question, and that's actually why Stokes drift is so prominently here. I mean, all of the work I've shown you so far, the parameterizations of Stokes drift for the sargassum, for the kelp, those were also all assuming that it was exactly at the surface. The Stokes drift, of course, is a very rapid decay, and Ton van den Bremer, I mean, his name already came up. He even says that the net effect of the Stokes drift and the anti-Stokes force and the interaction with the Coriolis force really means that maybe Stokes drift is should be thought of very differently for Lagrangian transport. Maybe he would be a good person to also have in this seminar series at some point to talk about, well, really what does Stokes drift mean in a global context? Yeah, but that is
a suggestion.
Big questions. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're at the end of the hour, and so we should wrap up because I'm sure people have other things they have to do. But this has been really wonderful. Thank you so much, Erik.
Thank you.
Really great discussion.
And don't forget about the job, right? Oh, so see you around.
Lots of early career people to apply. Okay. Bye.
Bye.